Thanks for staying with us. Now, the poor will be cushioned for some time to come. President Cyril Ramaphosa says the social relief of distress grant will continue. He says over 7 million people benefit from the grant, and advocacy group Black Sash is one of the organizations that have called for an increase on social grants. Rachel Bukasa is with the organization and she joins me now. Thank you so much for your time, Rachel. I must say that the president also insinuated in his State of the Nation address that we will most likely hear more details about the social grant during the finance minister's speech at the end of February. Do you welcome this? It seems as though there might be some kind of increase.
So, yes, absolutely, we welcome this. We welcome the indication that, of course, the calls over the last couple of years, and particularly the last year, hasn't fallen on deaf ears, and that the president as well as the presidency have really heard this call. And when we're talking about an increase, what we're hoping it's going to happen is going to take into account inflation, and it's going to take into account the food poverty line as well, because it's one thing to say people receive 350 Rand, and it's another thing to say that people receive grants where they can actually sustain themselves with dignity.
So how much would you say the grant should be increased by?
So at this stage, different people have different ideas. But in terms of Black Sash, what we're saying is we need to consider things from the minimum food poverty line at least, because that at least means that people are able to live life in a dignified manner. So currently the food poverty line is at 624 Rand. And that needs to be taken into account when you're looking at things like the child support grant, when you're looking at things like the SRD grant. And of course, the argument around fiscus is always there. But I think when we're considering that, we need to do that from a human rights approach and not from a purely economic perspective alone.
So if you look at it from a human rights approach, the social distress relief grant, how much do you think it should be increased by? Because if you listen to the State of the Nation address yesterday, it seems as though the president is indicating that National Treasury is trying to find a way to increase that. If you had to put a figure on that, I don't want to put you in a corner, Rachel, but if you had to put a figure on that, how much would you say realistically should it be increased by?
Absolutely. Realistically, we've had these conversations with the presidency as well. Realistically, our call is the same. It to be somewhere near the food poverty line so that people can look after themselves. And the argument that the money isn't there or it's not affordable, we've said to the presidency as well as the Minister of Finance, we've said to them, let's put an expert panel together, different people, economists, whoever it might be, and let's see if we can't model how to afford this. Because in terms of civil society, we've done studies, we've proposed 7 different ways, I know some studies done by IEJ as well, of how this could be funded. And right now what we have is not a case of not being able to afford it. It's a case of not wanting to engage in those conversations. So the argument that there simply isn't money simply is not one that we're prepared to accept. In fact, we know that currently we cannot afford not to have a basic income support.
What would you say to critics, Rachel, that say there are too many people that are dependent on grants and government should be looking at other ways, for example, creating jobs to sustain people and not social grants?
We're on the same page. We're not in disagreement that job creation is important. In fact, one of the things we've always said has been that it's a job and a grant, because a job is a source of dignity and a job is a way that someone can look after themselves. But the government has had almost 30 years to provide these jobs and they haven't done that. So no one is preventing them from job creation, from creating jobs from people. And I'm sure if you asked an ordinary citizen on the street, what they would do is they would rather have a job instead of being on a grant. So no one is disagreeing with that. But what we're saying is that in the absence of great job creation for people, for the majority of South Africans or people living in South Africa, there needs to be something in place. And that something in place is a grant until government can sort itself out.
Let's quickly speak about another very big issue and possibly a crisis that is brewing when it comes to the administration of these social grants. We do know that they want to centralize it to the Post Bank, but we do know that there are many challenges when it comes to that. Do you think that government should just leave things as is? And do you think that there is a crisis brewing in terms of administering these grants?
You know, that was quite something that I found mildly amusing in yesterday's speech. The assumption was that this is something we're thinking about, but the transition from the South African Post Office to the bank, to the Post Bank has already happened. The Post Bank is already administering these grants, and that's why we saw the crisis with the payments over November and December. So this isn't something they're considering. This is something that's been done. Yes, it hasn't been communicated, and issues around who was consulted, who knew what when, those issues haven't come to light yet, but it's already a fait accompli, essentially. It's been done, and that's how things are operating currently. So the suggestion that it's on the way, we found it quite amusing, to be quite honest.
Yes, I mean, there are obviously many challenges, and I remember in November and December I had received a number of messages and inboxes of people saying, the grants aren't being paid out, there's a delay in payments, it's causing a lot of distress. I just want to move over to accessibility. So many people who benefit from social grants, especially the elderly, don't often have access or can't often get to the various distribution points. This is obviously something that government is aware of. Do you think they've just neglected this aspect of the distribution of social grants, or do you think that it's just too big for them to handle and they are obviously just trying to narrow it down to, for example, the Post Bank?
At this rate, quite frankly speaking, sometimes the line between political will and actual just not having the competency to do something is actually really blurred. But the challenges, yes, they are aware of what the challenges are. As Black Sash, what we've done was ensure that we've done studies, we've shown them real lived experiences of people on the ground and what they're experiencing, particularly people who are far from your town centers and city centers. So it's not an issue that government does not know. It is an issue that they know, and in fact, we've also proposed solutions around these things. But it's an issue of political will more than just wanting or not being able to do something. Because if the political will is there, and maybe it's the knowledge of how to get something done that's not there, you would approach the relevant stakeholders to do that. But because that hasn't happened, it's clearly an issue of political will, where it's just we want to tick the boxes, and it doesn't matter who's really getting things and who's really not getting things on the ground. But what we're concerned about is on the ground, the elderly, those who are disabled, those who are having to travel 3 days to access a grant, get there, and then there's no cash, and then stand in a queue an entire day. Those things that the middle class are privileged enough to separate themselves from, and therefore think that it's far away.
Certainly. And just lastly, Rachel, we do know that this grant has been extended time and time again, and I do understand that Black Sash has, of course, been calling for it to be made permanent. We're speaking about the social relief of distress grant. Why do you think it's important for the president to consider it being made permanent? I know you've briefly said you have many people in distress, and I mean, it is called the distress grant, but why should the president consider this as a permanent grant?
So one of the things we've always said, and the president himself has acknowledged, is that South Africa faces the triple threat of hunger, poverty, and unemployment. And during that time, so you've got the grants, even if it's not sufficient, but you've got an elderly grant, you've got a child support grant, you've got a disability grant, and a few others. But what about those 18 to 59-year-olds who are able to work but are not able to, and therefore are left destitute? Who looks after that big chunk of people? And so this is why what we've said is that the SRD has proven that a grant can be taken to people really fast, and a majority of people be able to access it. So this can be the tracks or the foundation point in which a basic income support grant is based. So essentially, a basic income support grant being for those people who are not covered by other grants. So your 18 to 59-year-olds who find themselves destitute, who find themselves unable to eat. There needs to be something in place for them. It's not a category of people you can pretend don't exist, because they do. And in fact, with the number of unemployment rate we have in South Africa, it becomes a bigger thing than perhaps your other economies. Those people need to be looked after. They are government's responsibility. Until proper job mechanisms and job creation mechanisms are in place, it is government's responsibility to make sure that people who are left without other options are looked after.
Certainly. We'll just also have to wait and see what comes out of the budget speech expected at the end of February. Thank you so much for your time. We do appreciate it. That was Rachel Bukasa from the Black Sash.